This is part 2 of my 41,000 mile review of my 2011 Ninja 250. In part 1 I didn't cover quite as much as I wanted to. Also in part 1 I mentioned Sonora Pass, north of Yosemite. I happened to be in Sonora Pass last week, so I figured I'd take some GoPro shots. And this is me going back towards the Bay Area in California. But I just want you to be aware that these video shots really don't do this area justice, so if you really want to see the natural beauty of this place, you really have to go there yourself. And I did see some sport bike riders, 3 or 4. You're pretty much going to have the road to yourself when it comes to motorcyclists, because it's probably 200 miles from the Bay Area. But I would suggest bringing a sack lunch. There's a lot of great places you can stop and eat, but there's not a lot of restaurants, except places like Bob's Bunker and stuff like that. So all that said, let's get started with part 2 of this 41,000 mile review. These are the things that we're going to talk about. Some of these things I'm going to touch on just briefly. Others I'm going to talk about in more detail. So the first thing is, why buy a small displacement bike? There's a lot of people on YouTube that talk about this, but I'm just going to mention briefly, because I'm 6'2", 200 pounds, and a lot of people would say, well, what are you doing? Why don't you buy a bigger bike? Well, there are 2 reasons people buy these small bikes, I think. Number 1, they're afraid of the power of the bigger bikes. And number 2, they just want to save money. Myself, I'm not really afraid of the power of bigger bikes. I'd like to have a huge super sport bike, like an R6 or something. But the problem is I'd be paying about $500 per month just to pay off the bike and also insurance. It's like $300 a month for full coverage. And probably be like $200 a month to pay off the bike. Whereas with this bike, it's already paid off, and I only pay about $10 per month for insurance. So there's a huge difference in cost. Of course, if you're rolling in the dough, then that really doesn't matter. As far as riding small displacement bikes, some people think you're not a real man unless you have a bigger bike. But the truth is, a lot of people ride these bikes, and they're a lot of fun, and they're just as reliable as the bigger bikes. And as a person who's put a lot of miles on this bike, I can tell you, and if you're listening to this video, you can hear my little 250 just screaming up these roads. And this is probably the most stress that I've put on this bike, going up and down Sonora Pass, because I think it's like a 2,000 or 3,000 foot elevation change, and the engine is just screaming to death. But this is the 3rd time that I've come through this area, and the bike, again, is just not affected. And there's actually a guy named Brian Van Dam. You may have heard of him. He sells track gear on something called tracksportgear.com or something like that. He's a real muscular, big macho guy, and he has an R1. But what's kind of surprising is that he says that when he's riding on the street, he actually does not ride his R1, he rides an R3. And I'll give you a link to the video where he talks about it, and the reasons that he gives are pretty much the same reason that I would give for riding a small displacement bike, and that is that you save a lot of money, and also these bikes are a lot more comfortable. The next thing I want to talk about is valve adjustments. I didn't mention in the previous video that with the bigger bikes, you do have to do valve adjustments every 15,000 miles, but with this particular bike, you have to do a valve adjustment every 7,500 miles. So that is one downside as far as cost. You'd probably, if there's a lot of people out there that would not even care, because you don't put 7,500 miles on your bike even in 2 or 3 years. But if you're commuting with this bike, you may have to do a full service every year, and that if you do that at a dealership, that's going to be $500. If you do it at an independent place, it's $350, but it is an expense. On the other hand, if you do the valve adjustment yourself, then it really doesn't matter. It's just the work you have to put into it once every year. I've owned this bike for 6 years, and I put 42,000 miles on it, so that's about 7,000 miles per year. The other thing I want to talk about is rain. This bike has been rained on about 200 times. This bike is not a toy for me. This is my commute bike. I do have a lot of fun on this bike, but it really isn't a toy. It gets me from point A to point B. And so when it rains, I still ride. And probably the most annoying thing about it is not the actual rain itself. The most annoying thing is that you have to get your rain gear on. You know, when I look out the window and I see rain, I think, oh man, I've got to put my phone in a bag, I got to do this, I got to do that, and that's really the annoying thing from my perspective. But I've left this bike, I've ridden it in the rain about 200 times, and I've left it out overnight in the rain about 100 times. And as far as I can tell, the bike is not affected. The only thing that really happens to it is the rain brings dirt into the ignition keyhole, so when you put the key into the ignition, there's a lot of friction, and it's hard to get it in there and hard to turn. But all you have to do is just put a little WD-40 in there in the keyhole, and that'll clean all that dirt out. Now somebody might think, well, wait a second, why are you leaving your bike out in the rain? Well, I don't have a garage, and you know, I don't even put a cover on it. Whenever it's wet, I just leave it out in the rain all night long. And the reason I don't put a cover on it is that somebody told me, a mechanic actually told me, that if you put a cover on a wet bike, then it makes the cover, it gives it like a mildewy smell or something like that. To be honest with you, I don't know if it's smart to put a cover on a wet bike or to just let the bike get rained on all night. The jury's out. But as far as durability of the bike, this bike is not affected at all by rain, as far as I can tell. And so if you're going down the street and your bike starts to get rained on, don't panic. You know, these bikes are designed to get rained on. It's probably not going to hurt them. Another thing I want to talk about is the speedometer cable. On my bike, the speedometer cable has made noise from time to time. And you know, if you're a mechanic, you probably know something about this. But if you're a new rider, you may be kind of freaked out by this when it first happens. Basically, when a speedometer cable is kind of dry, what it'll do is it'll actually make a really strange noise, like a siren. And if you've never heard that noise, it may kind of scare you. When it happened to me, it actually burned out some of my instrumentation bulbs. And when it happened the second time, it burned out my fuel gauge bulb. And you may have seen my video on how to replace a meter bulb. That's when my fuel gauge burned out. But most of the time when the speedometer cable makes noise, it really doesn't do anything. It's not harmful. So if you hear that noise, don't worry about it. There used to be a video on YouTube where a Ninja 250 rider recorded the noise while it was happening, but I wasn't able to find that video. On the other hand, if you watch Jay Leno's Garage, there's an episode with a comedian called Adam Carolla where he brings a classic Lamborghini, a black classic Lamborghini, on the show, and when they're driving down the road, his speedometer cable actually starts to make that same noise. And Jay Leno, of course, he knows a lot about cars, so he immediately recognizes it as a speedometer cable. But if you want to hear what it sounds like, you can go on that episode, and that's pretty much exactly the way it sounds. But again, the important thing is it's not something to worry about, but that has happened quite a bit with my bike. Another thing I want to mention is the handlebars on this bike are bent pretty severely. They're bent down. Now, some people might say, well, that's because your bike has been knocked over so many times, as I mentioned later on in this video and in part 1 of this review. But I honestly don't believe that that's what really caused the handlebars to be bent, because if it was the bike tipping over that bent the bars, I feel like the bars should be bent upwards. But my bars are actually bent downwards, and I think that's just caused by me pushing down on the bars. I'm not a particularly strong person, but I remember when I was a kid and I rode BMX bikes, I just tend to be really hard on equipment for some reason. I don't know, and the gooseneck on my bike actually bent forward, and the guy at the bike store said that in all his years working on bikes, he's never seen something like that. So I don't know, I'm not really 100% sure what caused the bars to bend, but I think just me pushing down on the bars in the last 6 years bent them, and I'm not sure if I should be concerned that they're bent. I did go and try to price handlebars, and I couldn't find bars for less than like $200, so I just said, well, forget about it. I'm not going to pay that amount of money to replace bars. But again, I don't know if this is something I should be concerned about or what, but there's nothing really I can do about it. I'm not going to pay $200. And another thing is the throttle sticks on this bike, and because the bike has a decelerator cable, it doesn't really seem to affect me. But if the decelerator cable ever did malfunction, then I'd be in a lot of trouble, because you know, the throttle just sticks. And I've tried everything that I know to do to make it run smoothly, because it gives the bike a much better feel if the throttle turns smoothly. And because right now it kind of has a sluggish feel whenever you use the throttle. And when I first had this problem, I actually tried replacing the throttle cables completely. Throttle cables aren't that expensive for this bike. I got brand new ones for like you know, $20 each, I think, at Partzilla. But that didn't really help. And I tried, before I replaced the throttle cables, I tried lubricating the cables, and I checked the spring on the carburetors, and I tried lubricating. The only thing that really seemed to help at all is I lubricated the switch housing. But now when I lubricate the switch housing, it doesn't really seem to do anything. And I've tried so many different things. I tried putting grease under the grip, and I can't even remember all the things that I've tried, but it just doesn't seem to make much of a difference. And I mean, the only theory that I have at this point is that the handlebars are bent, and so that's somehow stopping the grip from turning, but I don't think it's that. But that's the only theory that I have. So if anybody has any suggestions on how to you know, make that grip turn properly, let me know. So I'd like to say some things about safe riding, just some things that I've learned over the last 6 years riding this particular bike. You know, you may have seen these videos where people crash on motorcycles. You know, they have compilations of people crashing. And I was watching Cycle Cruiser's YouTube channel. You may have heard of him. He did a video where he said, you know, you shouldn't worry about crashing a motorcycle, but you shouldn't live in fear. And I agree with that 100%. But the one thing that I disagree is that he said you should not watch those videos where people crash the motorcycles. I believe that you, even though those videos are hard to watch, I believe that you should watch them, because I've learned a huge amount. I've learned a lot just watching the videos. When you watch those videos, you're going to learn two things. Number one, you're going to learn the situations that people get into that result in them, you know, in their death or their severe injury. And number two, you're going to understand the consequences for getting into those situations. I'll give you an example. When I was riding home last week from the Mammoth area, there was this girl on some sort of a Harley. She zooms past me, and she was passing in a left-hand turn lane. There was a lot of there was a middle lane that was designed for left-hand turns, and she was passing cars going in that left-hand turn lane. I saw a video once where a motorcyclist was trying to pass, and then all of a sudden the car turns into the left-hand lane all of a sudden and just smashes right into the motorcyclist. For that reason, I knew not to do that. You know, I knew what would happen. You know, when you're driving down the road, if you haven't seen that situation, it's not going to register in your mind. You're just going to think, oh, it's a passing lane. I can just pass right in there. But, you know, there's a reason that that's a left-hand turn lane. Somebody can turn left in there and just smash right into you. Those are just some examples. Another example, well, I guess I should give some more examples. There's the situation where you're turning left and there's a car in front of you also turning left, and then all of a sudden for some reason that car stops while he's turning left. I've seen a lot of riders rear-end cars in that situation, because you're following too close and you think, well, the car's not going to stop midway in a turn. Well, the reality is that does happen. And when you're on a motorcycle, it's almost, if you're following closely, you're just going to ram right into the back of them. And I saw a video, I think it was a guy with a Ninja 250, the video might still be up on YouTube, where that happened. So I now know stay away from people when you're turning left. Stay leave a lot of room in front of you. I talked to a guy at Best Buy who was in that same situation. He was riding a Super Sport, and he just the car stopped in front of him, and he just crashed right in the back of him. And another situation that you find is just people turning in front of you. And when you see the consequences of what that happened, of that happening, you can, it really, it's solidified in your mind what can happen if you are not careful. You have to pretend as though you're invisible to cars when you're on a motorcycle. And, I could probably think of a lot of examples, but just one more example. There was a guy in a scooter with a passenger, and he was going down the road, and there was a car in the opposite direction turning left, but the car could not see the motorcyclist coming because there was a bus, going. It stopped in the turn lane to turn left in the other direction. It's kind of hard to explain, but the car didn't see. There's this huge blind spot, so the car turned, and the scooter just smashed right into the car. And those are the type of things that can happen. But you don't know for sure until you actually see these videos. So they're incredibly educational videos, and they could save your life. And I would say that these videos may have already saved my life. So I would suggest watching those videos. Now I want to mention something about using your brakes. Now the DMV tells you to never use your brakes in a turn. Something that I don't really hear people talk a lot about is that that's not really completely true. I would say that it is true that you should never use your front brake in a turn. There may be some situations where you might want to use it, but if you use a front brake in your front brake in a turn, you're probably going to lose control and you're probably going to crash. But on the other hand, I use my rear brake turning all the time. As long as you don't stomp on the brake, the rear wheel is probably not going to slide out. And this is something that I don't really hear a lot of people talking about, and so I just figured I'd mention it. You do have to be careful. As long as you're not going really fast, and as long as you're not at a very severe lean, then it's okay to use your rear brake, at least with my bike. Now, I can't say that that's true for every single bike. You have to be cautious whenever you use your rear brakes in a turn. But some people who are expert riders, they'll actually use their brake in a turn to actually skid out the rear tire on purpose around corners just for fun. Another thing I want to mention is people say that you shouldn't shift when you're turning. Again, this is something that is just, for me personally, I shift all the time when I'm turning. It's just not something that really seems to affect the handling of the bike. I think as long as you shift smoothly, then it's probably not going to affect you much in turns. But again, you're given this hard advice that you should never shift in a turn, and I just don't think that's really realistic. Another thing that you'll hear about is countersteering. I've put 42,000 miles on my bike, and I've never thought about countersteering one time on my motorcycle. As long as you know how to ride a bicycle, then you probably know how to countersteer without even thinking about it. So it's just really not something that you have to think about. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is working on your motorcycle. Here's my advice about working on your motorcycle, and this is mostly directed towards people who have never worked on their motorcycle and they want to know, is this something that I should do? If you grew up in a family of mechanics, and obviously you don't need my advice, but if you're somebody who is new to motorcycling and never worked on your bike, here's my advice. If you enjoy working on your motorcycle, then don't ever let somebody talk you out of doing it. You should work on your motorcycle. If you have a passion for doing it, if you feel a sense of accomplishment and pride working on your motorcycle, then there's no reason that you shouldn't do it. I love working on motorcycles. I don't know what it is about it, but the sense of, you get a more personal relationship, a closer relationship with your motorcycle. If you do it yourself and you become confident working on your motorcycle, you can make sure that the jobs are done correctly. You can save a lot of money, and it just gives you a great sense of accomplishment to be able to work on your motorcycle. You don't really need any special training to work on a motorcycle. Some people say, well, I haven't gone to a school to learn how to work on my motorcycle, so maybe I shouldn't do it. Well, the truth is, most mechanics, if there's something they don't know, they just get the service manual. If you have the motorcycle manual, and I would also recommend getting a third-party manual, for example, like a Climber or Haynes manual. And if you combine that with YouTube and just your common sense, there's no reason that you can't work on a motorcycle. Now, it is true that there's a lot of stuff that, if you've never done it before, it can be pretty challenging. For example, removing a counter sprocket. Whenever you replace your chain, it's traditional to replace your sprockets also. The first time you try to remove a front sprocket, that little sprocket that connects to the transmission, if you're not experienced doing that, it can take you a whole day just to get that done. Now, I have a special tool that I got from a company called Sprocket Stuff that can make it a lot easier. But stuff like that, if you're not experienced, it can take you a long time. Also, another job that is really difficult is removing and installing tires. I would say that those are probably the two most difficult jobs I've done on a motorcycle, is probably removing and installing tires. That's number one. And number two is removing a counter sprocket. But if you enjoy this type of work, you're going to figure out how to do it, and you're going to have a huge sense of accomplishment after you finish the job, and you're going to feel good about yourself afterwards. On the other hand, if you are only doing this work to save money and you don't really enjoy working on motorcycles, I would say don't do it. Don't work on your motorcycle, because it's just going to be a huge amount of time and energy. Working on motorcycles can be kind of challenging. You're going to have situations where you don't have the right tool. You have to go to the hardware store. That takes 2 hours out of your day. You'll strip a bolt, and what do I do about it? Or I have the right tool, but it doesn't fit, or I have one socket, but I need two sockets of the same size. The exhaust pipe is in the way of the caliper, and I can't get the right socket in, and just all kinds of stuff like that happens all the time. It's just normal. You have to get used to it. And if you really don't enjoy working on bikes, then it's not going to be worth it. It's better just to pay somebody to do that work. So again, that's my advice. If you enjoy working on motorcycles, do it. You just need the service manual and, independent manuals, YouTube, so on and so forth, and you'll be fine. But on the other hand, if you don't enjoy working on your motorcycle, I would not suggest doing it at all. Don't even dabble into it. Just let somebody else, let a mechanic handle it. In fact, there's a guy named Ari Henning who is he works he has a YouTube channel called I think it's called MC Garage, and I watch that channel quite a bit. It's entertaining. They have quite a few videos. I think they're not there anymore. Him as well as some other guy, they went to a Motorcycle Trend, but their videos are still up there. And one of the questions that people asked was, did you go to school for motorcycle mechanics? And he said he didn't. He just read a lot of service manuals. And that's exactly the type of thing I'm talking about. Mechanics, my mechanic actually said that he thought that motorcycle mechanic schools are scams. That's the actual word that he used. He said that mechanics that were really good, they could have been good without going to the school, and mechanics that are not good at all, the school would not have made them better mechanics. And it's not that I'm trying to badmouth formal schools, but I've been studying formal schooling for the last 20 years, and my advice is, if you want to learn how to do something, just go out and do it. Don't go ask somebody permission to do it. Just learn how to do it, and that's the fastest and best way to learn something, is just simply to do it. Formal schooling is not a good way to learn by any stretch. And a lot of people are probably going to be upset, who would hear something like that, but it's just a fact. Formal schooling is not a good way to learn. You're put in a classroom with a bunch of other students, and you're working on a motorcycle that you may never work on in your real life, and they're making you do this, they're making you do that, everything other than what you actually want to do, and you're not interested in what they're telling you to do because you're not doing something that you're actually going to use, and it just goes on, and that's basically what formal schooling is. Everything that I do on this bike is something that I need to do and something that I want to do. Whereas, in contrast, just about everything that you do in some formal school is something that you don't want to do and don't need to do, and is not something that is specific to your exact bike. And there's no amount of excuses or bullcrap that's ever going to, excuse that fact. People are going to make up excuses and say, no, you're going to learn all this stuff. No, you're not. Most of your time is going to be spent learning things that you're not going to use, and that's a fact. So all that said, if you do work on your bike, I want to mention a website. It's called, I think it's called Ninja 250 Wiki or something like that, WIKI. If you haven't gone on this website is a huge resource. And so most of the website is the third generation Ninja 250, but there's a lot of information about the fourth generation. And keep in mind, the fourth and third generation, there's a lot of similarities between those two bikes. Also, they were nice enough to put a link to my valve adjustment video. There used to be a video called from somebody called a Yeager Group or something like that, and that was a really good website for valve adjustments, but they took it off for some reason. The website isn't up. So they put a link to my valve adjustment video, but you should check out that website. Also, there's a guy named WedgeInator who has a Kawasaki ZX6R. I think it's probably like a 2008 or something like that. And he was nice enough to put a valve adjustment video. He doesn't show a lot about the actual job, but he talks about it. And that was one of the things that gave me the confidence to do a valve adjustment on my bike. And so you're not going to find a lot on YouTube that's really comprehensive, but you will find things that are extremely useful. For example, there was a guy that showed how to replace a headlight bulb. And, the camera angles were poor, and the lighting was poor. And most people who put YouTube videos up, they're not getting paid for anything. So they're not going to go to the effort to do a Spielberg video. But just seeing what they're doing is a huge help. And videos like that headlight bulb video, they really helped me to have the confidence to replace the headlight bulb in my Ninja 250. Also, there was quite a few videos on oil changes, and that'll give you the confidence to, change the oil in your bike. So the last thing I'd like to talk about is all the times that my motorcycle has been seriously hit. As far as I can tell, I think there's 9 times that I've counted so far that it's been hit. And I explained in the previous video, part 1 of this 41,000 mile review, why my motorcycle gets hit so many times. It's just because I live in front of a supermarket parking lot, and I don't have a garage, so I put it on the street. And the street is on an incline, so people will overcompensate. But I'm just going to go through all the times that my motorcycle has been hit. The first time it was hit, it was slammed into on the side of the opposite the kickstand, so it kind of just rotated it 70 degrees, and it damaged the fairings, and it damaged some other stuff, so that cost like $850, mostly because of the cost of the fairings. And the person left a note, so that was good. The second time, somebody pulled out and they nicked the front tire on the side of the kickstand, so it actually fell over. They left a note, and I think that situation, I didn't even charge anything because nothing was really damaged, if you can believe it. The third time, I was actually removing I had already removed the rear tire, and I took off the rear sprocket. I was replacing the drive chain, And so I installed the rear sprocket in. I had the rear wheel in my room, and then I went out and there was a note that said the people above me, the people that live above me, they knocked over my motorcycle when it was on the rear stand. There was no rear tire on it. So that's when the most damage occurred. Bikes are designed so that they don't fall on the side of the kickstand where all the shifting is. But if your bike does fall on that side, you know, there's more damage that occurs. You know, the typical things like the handlebar end and the foot peg were scratched. But the choke lever actually snapped off, and the clutch lever, the end of the clutch lever snapped off, and the straps on the California emissions canister, if you're out of California, you probably don't even know what that is, but it's just a Ralph Nader mechanism that tries to collect the smog from the motorcycle. That the strap snapped off, so there's quite a bit of damage, and the foot shifter was bent. But I think it amounted to like $350 of damage, $250 for parts and $100 for labor. Anyway, so I went out there, and the bike was on its side, and you're not supposed to leave a bike on its side because, you know, the gasoline will go into, you know, certain passages, and it's just not a good idea to leave a bike on its side like that. So I wanted to pick it up, but I couldn't pick it up because there was no rear wheel on it, so I needed somebody to help me. So I asked the people above, you know, if they'd help, and it was like 2 o'clock in the morning. There was nobody else around. So I asked the people, and the woman, the man's wife came to the door, and she said, well, I don't want to wake my husband up. She said, I'll help you move it. And of course I knew that we wouldn't be able to pick it up because, you know, it was just too heavy. So she tried to help me pick it up. We could not pick it up. And so luckily, you know, there was a guy who just happened to be walking by at 2 in the morning, and he helped me put it back on. But it was kind of annoying because she wouldn't even wake up her husband, you know, after they both were in the car and they knocked over my bike. They wouldn't even she wouldn't even wake up her husband to help me pick it up. And then when I told them how much it was going to be, they refused to pay the whole $350. They would only pay $250. So that was an interesting experience. So I just ended up installing all the parts myself anyway. And the fourth time it was hit, I can't remember exactly, you know, what, I lost track of which time was which, but the fourth time was probably the time where somebody backed into it and they smashed into it, and it rotated about 70 degrees again on the side opposite the kickstand. But this time they actually snapped the bracket that holds the brake light sensor, the rear brake pedal, the rear brake master cylinder, and the right driver foot peg. They snapped that bracket in half. It holds all of that. And that was the one time that they didn't leave a note, and I had to pay $90 for that. One of the viewers of my videos said that he had to replace that part, and it wasn't too bad, I guess, to replace it. It did take some time because you had to disconnect all that stuff, but that was the fourth hit. And then the fifth hit, somebody just hit it again on the side opposite the kickstand, rotated it 70 degrees, and nothing really happened. My cover got a little ripped, so I had them pay me for the ripped cover. It's about $100. And then the sixth time, I think we're on number 6, I was locking my bike up to the tree, as I always do in front of the place where I live, and I was bending down to lock it, and this woman came up and wanted to park next to my motorcycle. So I figured, well, I should probably get up. You know, I don't want her to accidentally pin me, you know, against my motorcycle. So I got up and I waited for her to park. I don't know what her problem was, you know, if she was nervous because I was standing there, or maybe she just was reckless or just wasn't a good driver. But I stood there and I kind of watched her, and she pulled up so fast to my motorcycle, I couldn't believe it. She pulled up about an inch away from my motorcycle, just reckless driving. She pulled up so fast, I was like, whoa, you know, what are you doing? That's reckless driving there. And then she slammed it into park and let off the brake. And you know, when you let off the brake, the car, you know, tends to go forward a little bit. Well, the car kind of leaped forward about 2 or 3 inches, smashed into my bike because she was so close to it. She smashed into the bike flew over, slammed into the ground, and the mirror just snapped off and rolled down the street. And that was the one time where I actually watched the whole thing happen, and that was interesting. So again, I almost thought that I was on candid camera. You know, I didn't know why somebody would drive that recklessly, especially right in front of a person, and especially around a motorcycle, because motorcycles are more vulnerable. They have more exposed parts, and they don't weigh as much as a car, so you want to be extra careful around a motorcycle. This person was just, I don't know what she was doing. And when she got out of the car, she actually had a grin on her face, like she didn't understand like what was a big deal. So she just said, well, here's my insurance, and so on and so forth. So I didn't get mad at her. But again, I was just shocked. Why would somebody do that? And so that was I can't remember, I guess that was the 7th time. Then the 8th time that it was hit, I was parked in front of Ace Hardware, and somebody kind of just bumped into it and moved it about a foot or two, but it didn't fall over. So that wasn't a big deal. They left a note, and I didn't really charge anything. And then which time are we on? 8 or 9? The next time I was working with a student. I'm a tutor, and I was, working with a student. This little 8-year-old, we're sitting doing math, and all of a sudden we hear this huge crash. And 30 minutes later, when the tutoring session was done, I go outside, and sure enough, there's my motorcycle on the ground. And that was the first time that a turn signal actually got broke, but also the mirror snapped off. So replacing the turn signal wasn't very expensive, and the mirror wasn't too expensive. That was the second time I replaced a mirror, so I knew how to do it. And that was about $100 of damage. And the 9th time that there was a major hit was, I'm ashamed to say, it was after I performed a valve adjustment, and I was pushing the bike from the front out of the garage that I was renting at that time. I did rent a garage for a period of about a year and a half. The kickstand was down, but it pushed up against some boxes and pushed the kickstand up, and I let the bike go, and that was the only time where I myself actually dropped the bike. And again, I'm ashamed to admit it, but that was a couple of years ago. And in that case, it was just the typical things, foot peg and handlebar. That was pretty much all that needed to be replaced. And when I say handlebar, I mean the handlebar weight. And a lot of people would say, well, why would you even replace the handlebar weight? Because I've actually replaced handlebar weights like 4 or 5 times with this bike. And people would say, well, why do you do that? They don't need to be replaced. Well, the reason that I replace the handlebar weights is if the bike is knocked over and somebody just pushes it up and then kind of leaves, I want to know that something happened. I want to know if it was hit. And so that's why I always replace the handlebar weights at the tips of the handlebars, just to know, I want to know if it actually was damaged or knocked over. And so those were the major times that the bike was hit that I can remember. Again, it's been hit so many times that I have trouble remembering. There were a few minor hits. For example, one time I was locking my bike and a guy backed up and he actually touched the exhaust pipe with his bumper. So I walked up to the driver next to his window and said, hey, pull forward, you're hitting my bike. And he just pulled forward and then took off and left. So technically it was actually a hit and run. So this bike has been through quite a bit. But it's a testament to the reliability of the bike, because in almost every single case, as I mentioned in part 1 of this video, in almost every single case, the bike's primary function has not been affected. So those were just a few more things I wanted to go over with my Ninja 250. So thanks for watching.